Hi, this is not Arnold, but you should still listen to the 430 Movie podcast at 430movie.com. It's really fun. You'll like it.
Hey, I'm Mark A. Altman.
And I'm Darren Doctorman.
And you are listening to Inglorious Treksperts. Welcome to our new podcast where we'll talk about all things Trek.
Well, most things Trek. The stuff that we like, we're going to talk about.
The stuff that we like. Yeah, look, there are a lot of people talking about Star Trek, but, we're going to bring out some of the great Treksperts, experts, people who worked on the show, people who admired the show, people who just love the show. And you never know what to expect. This is not a show where we're going to review episodes. It's not a show where we're going to sort of march you chronologically through the history of Star Trek. But it is a show where we celebrate what we love.
We celebrate the love.
That's you're mixing metaphors. That's a Star Wars reference on the Star Trek podcast.
It's all good because it all feeds into our wonderful fandom. And, you don't need to ignore everything that you love to talk about something that you do love.
I want to tell you a little something about Darren Doctorman. Darren Doctorman, in addition to being a leading concept artist in Hollywood, was the visual effects supervisor on the Star Trek The Motion Picture Director's Edition, and which was a marvelous release of Star Trek The Motion Picture on DVD several years ago, right before Robert Wise passed away.
That's correct.
And it was a wonderful thing that you did and contributed to the history of Star Trek by being able to take that film and, quote-unquote, finish it the way that Robert Wise had hoped it to be.
I was very honored to have been able to work on that project with my producing partners, Mike Mattasino and David Fine. We got to work with Robert Wise, and he had never talked about the film for 18 years after it came out because of his experience with the film and with how it was received and how the studio treated him and all sorts of things. And he was very quiet about what had happened, and he felt he was very rushed, and he never got the final cut. And so finally when we came to him and proposed this idea, he said, that might be a good idea. And he looked at it as having a closure on this project that he had put so much effort and time into back in 1978 and 79.
I was at a few of those screenings, one of them particularly at the Directors Guild, and it was remarkable to see Robert Wise, who I had so much respect for, from Day the Earth Stood Still and Sound of Music and all the great movies that he made over the years, to see him finally pleased with the final result on Star Trek The Motion Picture after all those years.
The smile on his face at the Paramount premiere that we had for it was so good to see. He was finally at peace with this thing that he wouldn't talk about. Yeah. And it was really great to be a part of.
And then, of course, Darren, you also worked on Voyager briefly as well.
Well, I worked on the pilot for Voyager because they needed some extra stuff done, and poor Rick Sternbach was being worked down to the bone, and so I came in for a couple months to help out with things, and that was fun. And I got to be in one of the offices above Stage 9 that are featured in Sunset Boulevard, which was a lot of fun.
Yeah, that's pretty amazing. And you look down and can see the ghosts of Cecil B. DeMille and Gloria Swanson.
There's a lot of ghosts. Even more now.
I have to say before we start talking about what the show is going to be, I first ironically met Darren when he was the host of a radio show, a syndicated radio show.
I was a co-host.
Okay, that's
co-host. Joyce Mason
right.
was the host of it, and she also ran Bill Shatner's fan club at the time. And she and her a couple of friends started this show called Talk Trek on a local radio station in Southern California, KIEV. And I got involved, and me and my friend Dylan Del Gercio at the time, and we
You're not friends anymore?
He passed away.
Oh.
He passed away several years ago.
I guess you're not. Sorry.
No. Well, we still are. But it was the craziest kind of. This was way before the internet started happening, and it was basically a call-in show that crazy people would call in and talk about Star Trek. And it was very wild and wacky and sometimes incredibly boring, but other times really fun because we had amazing guests calling in and appearing in the studio. And one of those guests was Mark A. Altman.
The A stands for amazing.
That's right.
That's right. So, yeah, I mean, I think it was when Rob and I were promoting Free Enterprise.
I think it was before that.
It was before.
It was
it
even
must have
before
been
Free
before that
Enterprise.
because, of course, you're in Free Enterprise.
Right.
So, I don't know what I was doing there.
I think you had just done some story. You were promoting Sci-Fi Universe.
Oh, yeah. I was doing a science fiction magazine at the time for Larry Flint. Not that kind of magazine. Get your mind out of the gutter. It was a science fiction magazine for Larry Flint called Sci-Fi Universe, and we were on the show to promote. And that's where I first met Darren and Joyce Mason.
That's right.
But I'm not still friends with Joyce Mason.
No, she passed away as well.
She did?
Yeah.
When did that happen?
This was about 6 or 7 years ago.
Oh, my God. I had no idea. She was a lovely woman.
She was. And, we're all in the Trekkies movie. Briefly, and that was a fun time. And I specifically kept my mouth shut and refused to be interviewed for that movie. So
yeah, I'm not a fan of that film. And in fact, it was really funny because when we did Free Enterprise, you have to register titles with the MPA. We had registered the title potentially Trekkers, and so Paramount could not release Trekkies as Trekkies because we had Trekkers, and they had to come to us to get us to release the title Trekkers in order for them to call their movie Trekkies.
Wow.
Which we did after making them. Yeah, no, we
crazy.
It's
crazy how things work out.
But I'm not a huge fan of that because that sort of leans into that Saturday Night Live depiction of Star Trek fans.
Yeah, it makes
get
fun
out of
of
your
Star Trek
parents'
fans.
basement. Aren't they weird?
It puts them in a sideshow, which I think is unfair.
And of course, that was a big impetus for Free Enterprise when we did Free Enterprise. It's almost 20 years since we did Free Enterprise. It came out in 1999, the week after The Phantom Menace.
Right.
And basically, it was to show that Star Trek fans could be dysfunctional and a little odd, but that they also had a life, and we're not freaks who live.
Well,
in
it's
parents'
basically
basement.
trying to show people as real people. I mean, when they show sports fans in shows, they are actual people, and they just are excited about sports. We're excited about other things, and Star Trek is one of them.
Yeah, that's true. And that's what this show is going to be all about. It's about being excited about Star Trek. One of the things, there's a lot of talk of toxic fandom these days. And, people who are just, hate everything. You can't please them. Rian Johnson certainly encountered that with The Last Jedi. To a certain extent, it's happened in Star Trek fandom. But we're really here to celebrate the 50-year mission of the Starship Enterprise and not... And not be critical, not be. I mean, there will be times where we'll be snarky because that comes with the territory.
We've come to praise Star Trek, not to bury it.
Indeed, indeed, Mr. Caesar. But I will tell you that partially this podcast was inspired by my book with Ed Gross, The 50-Year Mission, which was a 2-volume. Hardcover edition from St. Martin's Press that came out for the 50th anniversary. The first book, which covered the original series through the original movies, and then, of course, the second volume, which went from Next Generation all the way through the JJ movies. And after the success of our podcast, The 430 Movie, we were looking at other possibilities because there are always possibilities, as Mr. Spock is fond of saying.
Sure.
And, Darren and I immediately realized that to have a chance to talk about what Star Trek has meant to us over the years and also bring in our so many of the people that we know who've worked on the show and have been involved with it over the, it was a real opportunity. There are a lot of Star Trek podcasts, but not a lot that aren't just fan musings. Right. And it's no accident that this podcast is called Inglorious Treksperts, because the people that you'll hear from over the coming months are truly Treksperts, people who either are industry professionals or people who have sort of a soapbox from which to talk about Star Trek that is based on a degree of expertise or knowledge that isn't just someone in their basement talking about Star Trek.
Right. We're not in a basement.
We're in a very nice recording studio, which is why we're recording it, so we can prove to you that we are not in the basement. If we were in the basement of this building, we would see where Jim Morrison recorded L.A. Woman.
There you go.
So, which is pretty cool. I know. So anyway, but here, on our first episode, we thought it was only appropriate to talk about the fall of 1987, because right now we're seeing a lot of new shows premiere.
Sure.
The six people that would not watch network television. Television has changed so dramatically since that fall of 1987. But in 1987, it was hard to believe, but Star Trek came back to television.
It came back to life. It was. We had all grown up with the original series and some of the movies by that time. And, of course, Star Trek IV had just come out to huge numbers in the theaters. And the buzz started, going around that there was going to be a new Star Trek show. And I, for one, thought, well, that's going to be interesting. I wonder what they're going to do. Because, it was anyone's guess as to what was going to happen. Finally, they announced what the title was going to be, Star Trek The Next Generation. And I thought, well, this could be either really, really good or really terrible.
Yeah, I remember that lead up so well, even to this day, when they announced. Because, there had been, what people forget is, there had been so many near misses. I mean, back in the 70s, it was Phase 2, and you would read Starlog and think, Star Trek's coming back to television.
Right.
With Kirk and David Coutreau.
And who? Yeah.
And it's so exciting. Zahn. Who's Zahn? But it was coming back with everybody, and they were building sets, and it seemed like this time it was really going to happen.
This time it's for sure.
Yeah, and then, of course, it didn't happen. The whole thing went to hell in a handbasket, and instead they made the first feature, Star Trek The Motion Picture. And then the features were hugely successful. And then Paramount began to realize that these features can't go on forever. The cast is getting older and more expensive.
I just want to talk a little bit about the years between seeing the original show and 87, when Next Generation came out. It was, before the movies, it was really a quiet, bleak time for Star Trek fandom. But even so, the grassroots fandom was probably at its highest in terms of creativity and in terms of excitement and in terms of love for this show that went off the air in 1969.
Well, it's true because it had not been co-opted by the studio, by exploitation.
The studio didn't even like it.
They didn't like it. They barely realized they had it.
Arguably, they don't like it now.
In
but
in the Desilu acquisition, they had acquired it along with Mission Impossible.
Right.
And they didn't care. And so you had your Aunt Fanny stitching together the Tribbles or something like the Federation Trading Post. In New York, which was a Star
Berkeley,
Trek store.
Yes.
And it was they were mocked when they opened for a store devoted to only Star Trek. What are you going to sell? Who's going to go?
Right.
And for a while, it was on the verge of closing, shuttering, because and then they started advertising on Channel 11 in New York during Star Trek.
Right.
And they had lines around the block.
Well, yeah, and remember, Channel 11 would run Star Trek every night at
6 o'clock.
6 o'clock. And that's where I first saw Star Trek. Every night was a new episode. And, of course, I had watched the animated show on Saturday mornings on NBC, starting in 73 and 74. And so it was all brand new to me because I had never seen it before, and I loved it. Every minute of it. And when I first went to the Federation Trading Post in New York, my dad took me, and I thought, oh my God, this is a place for people like me. And there were very few kids who liked Star Trek or certainly talked about it in grade school. And so I was basically on an island of my own. And seeing this wide open world of people who loved this show was completely world expanding. And it made me feel a connection with people that I didn't even know.
Well, I'll tell you something very embarrassing that I've never admitted before. But the first time I went to the Federation Trading Post, they had these giant 6-foot posters you put on the back of your door of all the principal cast. And I'm mortified to admit. Now, I was very young, clearly, and had not quite found my way in life. But I bought a 6-foot poster, not of Captain Kirk, not of Bill Shatner, my hero and friend, but of Leonard and Mr. Spock.
Oh, for a second I thought you were going to say Chekhov.
Oh, no. Even I was not that pathetic in middle school.
Look, there's nothing to be ashamed of about having a 6-foot-tall picture of Mr. Spock.
They were in the transporter room. It was pretty cool.
I remember it well.
Yeah.
I have the poster of all of them still from those days that my dad bought for me, of them all standing in the transporter room from the 3rd season, because you can tell by the shirts. But it was such a pure, joyous time, because, as you said, it hadn't been co-opted. It hadn't been, they hadn't brought in the ringers from TV to say, "Hey, you like Star Trek, so do I. Everything's great." It wasn't the sort of fake BS that sometimes we see. It was all real, and it was just so pure. And sometimes I yearn for those days of, being one of, maybe 2 people in the school who even knew about Star Trek.
Sure. And, I'll tell you one of the things that also, and I want to step on, because we're going to do a future episode on the merchandising.
Yeah.
And sort of growing up with and the evolution of that merchandising. But there was the poster book series,
Absolutely.
which were these great, magazines that would unfold into a poster.
Mm-hmm.
And they did about 12 or 13 episodes of those. I know Doug Drexler was involved with that very early in his career, who also worked at the Trading Post.
Yeah.
And he tells this wonderful story, and perhaps we should have had him as a guest, because he tells it obviously better than I, how one day it was raining, humid in New York, and he had glasses at the time, and he had to run out and get lunch or something for them. And his glasses are all fogged over, and he comes in the rain, huddled, underneath an umbrella and or a sweatshirt cover, comes in, and he runs in with the food and bumps into this man. He says, "I'm sorry." He looks up, and he's sort of wiping his glasses, and it's Gene Roddenberry. And he said, "I wanted to see what all the fuss was about."
That is amazing.
And I love that story. And apparently, he walked around and checked it out, because it wasn't licensed or anything like that. And at the time, he was the only one who wanted to make money off of Star Trek. And he approved, and he thought it was really great. And he said, "You're treating the fans well, and this is a great store." And of course, they had all these homemade miniatures they built, like the keeper and the captain's chair, and sort of Gene Roddenberry gave it his thumbs up of approval.
I'm guessing this is probably around 76 or 77.
Probably, yeah.
So Gene was probably in the midst of trying to either get Phase 2 or one of the movies going. So this was the time when he was trying to get excitement about Star Trek back, in the mainstream again.
Well, Gene was so great at, long before social media, long before marketing, and you would hire a phalanx of publicists to help you roll stuff out, about knowing how to work the fans and create a groundswell of support. Even going back to when they made the original Cage pilot, which he screened at a sci-fi convention in, what was it, Cleveland or St. Louis?
Right.
And they'd just shown Irwin Allen's The Time Tunnel, and the fans were all like, "Oh, not another Irwin Allen piece of garbage." And then Gene came, and he had set up this fashion show of props from Star Trek and costumes, and basically screened the Cage and got people so excited about Star Trek and about the show, and he kept going back to the fans and using them like his own personal army, because even the famous story, which is somewhat apocryphal, about how the fans saved Star Trek and it would groundswell, he was giving them money for postage and giving them, and helping advise them. And I had nothing to do, telling NBC I had nothing to do with it.
Yeah, no, but secretly he was leading them from the front office.
Yeah.
It's an amazing thing. I went and saw Gene Roddenberry at one of his college lecture tours in early 1976 at Kane College in New Jersey.
I'd ask you what he said, but we happen to have Gene Roddenberry right here.
Well, I said a lot of things back then, and not all of them have come out to be true or even funny. But the thing is, back then Star Trek was still an unmoving body, and we were trying
the first time Gene ever dealt with an unmoving body.
We were trying to resuscitate it as best we could, and I certainly was trying to get as much out of it as I could, and I would take the 16 millimeter prints of the cage and the famous blooper reel that Leonard was so upset about, and I showed them to these large audiences, and they, of course, loved every minute of it, and I talked about how it was bringing Star Trek to life, and how I'd hoped that Star Trek could come back soon and have a new life in movies or on television again.
You know what's incredible, because we talk about that era and how it was an more innocent time and less exploitation of the property. The big thing was the Inside Star Trek record album, which was a spoken word album.
Yeah, with Gene Roddenberry, DeForest Kelley, Mark Leonard, and Bill Shatner as guests that he would interview. That's where I got my Gene Roddenberry impersonation from.
You mean that wasn't Gene Roddenberry?
It wasn't Gene Roddenberry.
I thought we were channeling him.
Unfortunately, he was gone. He was gone for some time, but he lives on through me sometimes. I'm happy to say that I am able to drive certain ex-Star Trek writers insane with my Gene Roddenberry impersonation, and they have told me that if I do it in front of them again, they will punch me in the nose. And that is not Harlan Ellison. Anyway, it was such a strange kind of thing to listen to Gene Roddenberry, basically just talking to Mark Leonard. Tell me more about Sarek and about the history of Vulcan philosophy. And it was sort of intimate, but also sort of fake. It was a strange mix of both.
Yeah.
But it's astonishing. You can still find it available some places.
Yeah, but it's on CD. They reissued it on CD with new introductions by Nichelle Nichols.
Right.
About 10, 15 years ago,
Something
I think.
like that.
What's really interesting about the history of that album is it was produced by a guy named Ed Naha. Ed Naha is the guy who wrote the Science Fictionary, which is a book when we were kids. But more importantly, more germane to the story, is he was the A&R guy on Bruce Springsteen's Born to Run.
Wow.
So he goes from Springsteen to but he was a huge Star Trek fan. So when he goes to Sony Columbia Records and says, "Hey, I want to do this Star Trek thing with Gene Roddenberry," they think he's out of his mind.
Maybe he was.
He had a little juice from the whole Springsteen thing.
Wow.
And he ends up befriending Gene and getting Gene to do the thing, and then they had to convince Shatner to do it. And he tells the story about how Shatner just breezes into the recording session like 3 hours late in his tennis whites, and he's like. And they said, so this is what we're going to do. And then he just wants to talk about what he wants to talk about because that's Bill. And it's a great story. And then Ed Naha, years later went on to clear the music for the album that was on the famous album that went into space. On the Pioneer probe.
Wow.
And literally, they had to clear the music as though in case aliens get it, you got to make sure you're paying royalties to the artists.
That's right.
I mean, it's a crazy.
Royalties in the known universe. That means something.
Right. In this case, the legal clause that's in all contracts in this or any known universe, it actually means something.
That's funny. I have just a little story about Shatner's involvement with this album. I was lucky enough to go to the Star Trek Original Series set tours in upstate New York at the beginning of this year, when Shatner came and appeared and toured the sets and had a very nice sort of intimate group of like 25 people sitting around the bridge while Shatner sat in the captain's chair and basically just talked for an hour. And I got to ask him a question, and I asked him, Bill, back in the day before the movies, you did this album with Gene Roddenberry. I didn't see any recollection in his eyes that he had in fact done this. But I said, and Gene asked you a question, and it was, how much of Bill Shatner is Captain Kirk, and vice versa? And Shatner says, what did I say? And I said, well, you said, and I avoided doing the Shatner impersonation for him. I said, some parts of Captain Kirk I would like to be. I think a lot of Captain Kirk is what I am, and some of the parts of Bill Shatner that I don't like, I try to keep out of Captain Kirk. And he says, well, that sounds like a great answer. And then so I asked him, how would you answer that now, after all these years of Star Trek and all the years that have passed since then? And he said, well, that's a good question. I think now I am Captain Kirk. And everyone roared in the bridge, and it was a great moment.
And, there's sort of a meta irony to that because, of course, in Free Enterprise, you play Shatner's doppelganger, and you say, I am Captain Kirk. And then we reveal Shatner on stage rapping with the rated R. But that's a story for another podcast. Next year, Free Enterprise celebrates its 20th anniversary. I'm sure we're going to talk about that. And the other thing I think we should talk about, and I didn't have this on my list for upcoming episodes, is the fan film phenomena. You talk about James Cawley. And I think it's fascinating, whatever you think of the films, that people would go out and spend their own money and their time and their passion and create these things when they don't own the rights.
Right.
And I'm not talking about that in a negative way, just that, whether it be James or the guys who did Star Trek, you put, tens of thousands, not hundreds of thousands into these fan films. And it's a really fascinating thing to look at.
It's all related to the creative energy in the fan community. And I think that in those early years, before it was policed, there was so much creative energy put into fanzines, individual works of art, conventions, and radio plays and Super 8 movies and all sorts of things, that it was an explosion of fan creativity.
Yeah, that reminds me of, you talk about the early fanzines. And I really used to enjoy when I would go to the conventions. My parents would drop me and my friends off at the conventions, and because they weren't going.
Right.
And you go to the dealer's room. It was all homemade. There was very few.
Yeah.
I mean, other than the Bantam paperbacks, there was very little. And, you buy these fanzines, and there were the stories and people writing about the episodes. And, of course, there were those books like The Best of Trek, which had these generic covers in which they would write about, favorite episodes, or very much it was like a podcast on paper.
Right.
And, it was always from the pages of Trek magazine. But I never could find Trek magazine. I could only find The Best of Trek books. It's so funny because, here we set out to talk about Next Generation and the birth of Next Generation, but this is all, I think, the foundation on which Next Generation is built.
And this completely affected our reactions to Next Generation, certainly when it came out and later on.
Well, it was really interesting because there definitely was this passionate, vociferous group of fandom, not unlike what happens now with quote-unquote toxic fandom, which is magnified through the internet, where they're saying, if you don't, without Kirk, Spock, and McCoy, you don't have me. People were outraged that they would do a Star Trek series with a new cast and a new Enterprise. Do you remember how you felt? I remember being very excited until there was an article in Starlog where they put everyone's headshots, and it was about the casting of the roles, and it announced, playing Captain Jean-Luc Picard is Patrick Stewart, who I'd seen in Excalibur and I, Claudius, but
Life Force.
Life Force, yes, indeed, I did. And although I remembered Matilda May more than Patrick Stewart, but I will say that I was underwhelmed by there was no one who was really.
I think I first saw that group photo on, was it Newsweek maybe, or Time?
Right.
And I remember thinking, okay, well, this certainly looks different. I'm willing to give it a chance, because this is supposed to be, much later than Star Trek, and it is Gene Roddenberry there, so we'll see. I was lucky enough because a couple of my friends in film school at the time had access to one of the series Bibles that were put together by Dorothy Fontana and
David Gerrold.
Yeah. And I got to read it. I got to have a copy of it. And, of course, it had some pictures that Andy Probert had drawn of the bridge and of the new Enterprise. And I have to say that my first reaction was, okay. Not exactly thrilled about the new Enterprise, but, I'll give it a chance. We'll see. And actually, a funny thing is, during the first couple of episodes, there was a lot of, in the, pre-internet days when there were bulletin board systems, someone found a printout of one of my discussions with some other fans talking about the first couple episodes of Next Generation. And thankfully, my position was, a lot of these negative reactions are, equal to some of the negative reactions that some fans had about the original series. Let's give it a chance. Especially after Naked Now had come out and people were saying, well, this is exactly the same as the TOS episode, Naked Time, and what are they trying to do? This is just silly. They're trying to, redo the same thing over and over again. I said, give it a chance. This is a way to get to know the characters, and so I was extremely level-headed, much more level-headed than I am now.
You were younger.
I was young. I didn't know. But it was very strange because the same sort of bits of possessory feelings about Star Trek were coming out. Right. That, how dare they do something with Star Trek that I don't like.
Right.
And, all that has certainly been amplified a million times now. But I think all those feelings still existed even during the original show.
Interesting. Well, I'll tell you, I had an interesting introduction to Next Generation as well. I mean, I'd seen the casting and didn't really know or recognize anyone, and was still cautiously optimistic. I was excited that Star Trek was coming back to television. The first run syndication thing spooked me. In retrospect, it was obviously the best thing that could have happened because I don't think that show would have lasted 7 years on a network.
No way.
So I think it was a good thing. And I was out in California for the first time. And I happened to be on the Paramount lot for reasons I won't go into.
Just happened to be there.
Yeah. I was trying to get a job from the late Gary David Goldberg, and who I had met and had been interested in hiring me for something. He eventually ended up optioning a script of mine many years later. But the point of this being, I was at the commissary after my meeting or whatever, and they were shooting Farpoint. And so all the extras were taking lunch, and they were all in Starfleet uniforms.
Right.
And I got such a thrill because here I was on the Paramount lot. I was in college, and it was the uniforms were very redolent of the Star Trek the Motion Picture costumes. And it was really exciting.
And you were particularly excited about the male scant uniforms?
No, that did nothing for me. But I thought the uniforms were fantastic, and it was really cool. But what's interesting is, so then whatever it was, a few months later, it premieres. And I remember we got we rented a VCR for our house at college, so we could tape the episodes every week because none of us had a VCR. And so we went to Rent-A-Center and we rented a VCR, and we all huddled around our 19-inch CRT TV and watched Farpoint. And God, we wanted to like it so much.
Yeah.
Star Trek. The Next Generation is beaming aboard the airwaves. All the wonder, the excitement, the drama of Gene Roddenberry's original Space Odyssey.
Welcome to the Enterprise.
With all-new adventures from the 24th century. With an all-new Enterprise.
This is nothing like any vessel I've seen before.
And an all-new crew. Starfleet veteran Captain Picard, Commander Riker, Executive Officer, Chief Medical Officer Crusher, and her brilliant son, Wesley, Lieutenant Commander Data, an android. The telepathic Troy, Security Officer Yar, Geordi, a man with unique vision, and Klingon Officer Worf.
Shields and deflectors up, sir.
Go to yellow alert.
Their continuing mission to boldly go where no one has gone before.
Let's see what's out there.
Don't miss the all-new television adventures of Star Trek, The Next Generation.
At the end, the Solar Starfish show up, and we're just like, well, that was a little Squire Gothos, and that was a little this, and that was a lot. But, okay, it has potential.
Not bad.
It's not awful. D. Kelly was wonderful,
Yeah.
And it has potential.
It certainly looked good.
It looked good, and especially on a 19-inch CRT television in low def, as my wife would say. And so it had potential. Next week I had a similar reaction to Naked Now. It's like, why are you telling this story now? The whole point of Naked Time is to sort of reveal layers to our characters,
Right.
and it's like the second week we don't know our characters,
Right.
so revealing these hidden layers doesn't quite make sense. and not to mention it's a terrible episode.
And we find out that the characters really didn't have any layers.
Yeah.
We're pretty much okay. They're pretty much like they are when they're drunk.
And by the time you get to Code of Honor, look, a lot of people say, "Oh, that's the Amos and Andy sort of racist episode." I didn't really see it at the time.
Me either.
I think that's a stretch, and I was so happy it had a Fred Steiner score and there was some action, and
Right.
they go to a planet. It was like, oh, okay, well, at least it's something going on. Maybe the show's actually going to get.
It was dumb, but it wasn't offensive.
Yeah,
At least to me.
But it really wasn't until 100100110. I don't know what the name of that episode
Right.
is. So a lot of ones, a lot of zeros. But that I said, oh wow, that was a really great episode.
That was very interesting. It was a
Frakes
good
is
science
playing-
fiction idea.
The Binars are a great alien civilization. Frakes gets to show off his trombone skills.
Yes.
And there's a lot I like about that episode. And that was the first episode where I really said, oh, okay, the show has real potential. And then Heart of Glory at the time was also, people who just say, oh, the first season, the second season are terrible. There are little small gems to be mined in those seasons that people are very quick to forget about.
Well, there's about as much good in those first two seasons as there are in the third season of the original series.
Yeah. But here's the funny thing. So, I'm in college. I'm editor of the college paper, and we get this press kit one day comes in for Star Trek: The Next Generation, and it says, here's 20. I should have brought this. I could read you the whole list. I still have it. 100 ways that we suggest you cover the new Star Trek series, and it was like, write about how the real science impacts, on the science of Star Trek, and all this stuff, and then buried at like number 32. Visit the set and interview the cast. It was like buried in there, and I'm like, well, that sounds like a good idea. So I call the publicist, and I said, I'm a Brandeis University student newspaper, and I'd like to come with a photographer, my roommate, and I don't think he'd ever shot a photo in his life, and I'm interested in doing stuff. I said, well, we'd love to have you. I said, well, I'd love to come, and so I basically they set up the flight and fly me out, and I spent 2 days on the set of the Next Generation. They were shooting too short a season with Clayton Rohner,
Yes.
who ironically ended up was the boyfriend of Audie England, who later starred in Free Enterprise, and I was on the set, and that was where I literally interviewed the entire cast, met the entire cast. And
you set forward on your journey to become America's foremost Treksper.
I did. That was that led to me writing for Cinefantastic, and it led to me doing these other sci-fi magazines, ultimately doing 50-Year Mission. In fact, there's some interviews from that set visit. I had to, when I was writing 50-Year Mission, go back and in the garage and find these old cassettes that I had saved. And everybody's always saying, why do you save all this stuff?
Because I might need it.
I might need it someday. And sure enough, the problem is I didn't have a cassette recorder, so I had to go on Amazon and get a cassette recorder to transcribe it. And listening to me interview people when I was 18, 19 years old is very difficult. I had a very difficult time having to listen to me because I remembered. I'm still horrified. I think at one point I said to Patrick Stewart, it was the end of a long day, and I interviewed most of the cast, and I said, and at the time he'll admit it, he was a dick.
Right.
It was really. After a while, he started to loosen up thanks to the rest of the cast, and he became a lovely guy and learned to have fun. But at the time, he was very full of himself and just very serious. So I said, will the show have sort of the operatic, larger-than-life kind of Shakespearean, drama that Shatner brought to the or something like that? And he says, "What are you saying that Shakespeare is broad?" And he was just, "Is that how you're using Shakespeare as an adjective to describe?" And it was like, oh my God, I put my foot in my mouth. So I intentionally could never listen to that tape again. But it was great because it was
I
also.
think you ought to bring in that tape, and we ought to.
We play it on the
put it on the
podcast.
podcast.
Yeah, I think I'd be willing to do that at this point. It's funny because that was where I met John Frakes, and he had this radiant pink bathrobe that he would wear between takes because everyone hated the uniforms.
Sure.
They were so between takes, when he'd go back to Australia, he'd put on this
He'd
pink
slip the
bathrobe.
top off, and yeah.
And I remember when I was interviewing him, he was wearing the pink bathrobe. It was
Oh, my
like,
goodness.
oh my God, it was so funny. And, obviously I've known Frakes now for many years, and we worked together on The Librarians on a couple episodes. And, I just find him delightful. He hasn't changed a bit. He's as warm and sociable as ever. He's
That's a Star Trek the Motion Picture quote for all you people who
But he's
recognize
just a
him.
lovely, lovely man. He always was and has remained so. But I remember we were sitting on set shooting this episode of Librarians, and I just turned to him. I said, "I got a question for you, John." He goes, "Yeah, what is it, Mark?" I said, "Whatever happened to that pink bathroom?" He started laughing.
That's
It was
hilarious.
like dying. He said, "I have no idea." I said, "If you still had it, you probably could sell it on eBay for a lot of money." Because, Mark, I think you're right.
My goodness.
But I interviewed the entire cast that day. I did not like Denise, who also seemed to have a chip on her shoulder. It's funny. LeVar is another person who at the time, and he was a big original Star Trek fan, so I thought he was going to, wasn't super friendly. But
Arguably, he was the most known name out of that cast.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And in the years subsequent, he could not have been more charming.
Right.
And I just think he was under a lot of pressure.
Sure.
And I think they were doing a lot of interviews, and they were sick of doing interviews at the time, because I found him after that to be just charming. And everyone else was terrific. I mean, Marina was happy to have a gig, and so she knew how to work it. And, John, as I said, was great. And Brent, just super funny.
Right.
He really was. You could see the Groucho Marx
He
influence.
was just glad
on
to have
him.
a gig.
He was glad to have a gig, and it was really it was really interesting for me because I was also on the set for the finale for All Good Things.
Right.
So to have, and I'd been on the set many times in between, but to think and
To bookend it that
what
way.
was nice was when I was, because I was covering it for Cinefantastic or Sci-Fi Universe at that point, I was able to sort of talk to them about what it was like in the beginning and compare and sort of contrast where they were at the end of the journey and where they were at the beginning of the journey. It was really fascinating, and I felt I had, in a way, gone on this journey with them. But I do remember it was really hard sort of doing some of those interviews because, of course, I'd only seen Encounter at Farpoint and Naked Now when I came out to visit them on set. I'd only seen 2 episodes,
Right.
And
They were already like 6 in. by that time.
and it's really funny because I remember the first thing very vividly. The first thing that we did when we got there was the publicist after they introduced themselves. They introduced us to Mike Okuda, who gave us the set tour. So Mike, who of course doesn't remember this, but I remember vividly, took us around the sets, and I couldn't get over just how remarkable the sets were, because you really did feel like you were on the Enterprise.
Sure.
Because the corridors connected and, into the different sets and everything. And, of course, this was the same stage where they had filmed many of the movies.
Yeah, it was
So-
the same layout as the Enterprise in the movies.
Well, yeah, and they redressed
lot of the same corridors
same
with this,
sets.
yeah.
And then ultimately the movies would redress Next Generation
Right.
sets because they never spent enough money on these
That's
things.
correct.
But it was a really great experience, and I do feel there was a sense that most of us were pulling for the show to work. Nobody wanted to see it fail.
No.
You wanted to see the movies continue, with the original cast, but you also were hoping, and that Next Generation would find its way. And it really isn't until that 3rd season when Michael Piller joins the staff that it does begin
Sure.
to come together.
Well, it becomes something of its own. Right.
Yeah.
And we'll talk more about Next Generation in future episodes.
Absolutely. And it does begin to emerge from the shadow of the original and stand on its own 2 feet. And that's when Next Generation, I think, works best, when it's its own series and its own, and is not trying to do what the original show did. Because, Next Generation was never able to do humor as well. There were a lot of things that the original show did better. Certainly, we all know the scores of the original show are available in a beautiful box set from La La Land for the original show. Has never been topped. There was a fear of going. I'm reluctant to say big and bombastic because Star Trek in its original incarnation could be extremely subtle as well.
Sure.
But then you really do start to find show starts to find itself and go on to enormous success. But it was remarkable because there was definitely a sense that the show could go either way. And it's funny because both NBC and Fox were interested in acquiring the show, but they wouldn't commit this was in an era where NBC committed to 2 years of amazing stories, in which
Right.
they had committed to none.
Right.
And so no one was willing to make the commitment that Paramount wanted. And because of the huge startup costs, they couldn't afford the show to be canceled
Right.
after 13 episodes.
Right.
So what do? They greenlight it themselves for first run syndication and sell, what's called barter syndication,
Right.
where they get to sell a bunch of the ads, and
And the local stations
affiliates
get to have a certain amount of ads too. Yeah.
And it sort of kicked off, because until then you only had shows like Jeopardy and Wheel of Fortune in syndication. This kicked off the golden age of the 1 hour drama. For the next 10 years, you sort of had a huge amount of these first run syndicated series that paved the way for Deep Space Nine, but there were a lot of other shows, Babylon 5, through the PTEN network, which was Warner Brothers ad hoc. You had also Paramount trying to capture lightning in a bottle again with Friday the 13th, the series, which was an anthology horror series, and of course War of the Worlds, which was created by Sam and Greg Strangis, which premiered concurrently with Star Trek. Now, the interesting thing about Sam and Greg Strangis is that Paramount had originally had them develop Next Generation
Right.
before Roddenberry got involved, because people don't realize that they did not want Roddenberry involved because he was a handful, and
I don't know why anyone would think that.
and they developed a Bible, and they were pretty far along when Paramount had met with Gene, and who was irate that anyone else would do the show. Said, "Well, you've never, what about you? You've always said you'd never do it." "Well, I'm not going to let anybody else do it." And he ends up doing Star Trek, and basically Strangis, the dad, and the son are shown the door. They end up doing War of the Worlds.
We'll talk more about that when we talk about the untraveled journeys of Star Trek.
Yes, indeed we will, which is a future episode where we'll be talking about the abandoned JFK Star Trek II premise, Planet of the Titans, and of course, where Kirk fights Jesus on the bridge of the Enterprise. All fascinating stories that never saw the light of a projector bulb, but those are for future voyages. For now, this has been Darren Doctorman.
Darren Doctorman.
I remember your name.
And
I was going for the
and
dramatic
your-
Shatner
and your-
pause.
Mark A. Altman.
I am indeed. It's been a pleasure. Thanks for joining us here on Inglorious Treksperts, and we'll hope you'll join us next week for an all-new episode of Inglorious Treksperts. Wow, that was good. You got that little sound effect in there.
Good night, sweetheart. All my prayers are for you. Good night, sweetheart. I'll be watching